to Mr. Diaz. Let's violate the world. Let's bring our fantasies to realities. I'm extreme, calculated, and love it. Easy to make them vanish with no link to us in the least. Easier to find a loner guy. Less connection. I'd do a chokehold from behind. You hold him down, strap him up, not to be found again. He wasn't going to be going back. These are quotes from America Online instant messages between Master Scott, whom we now know is Scott Schweikert, and Dom Dude for Sub, who we now know is Stephen Lorenzo. These took place during the months of October, November, and December of 2003. Over the course of the next few days, you will hear more about these chats, and more importantly, the men behind these fictitious screen names and what led them to plan and ultimately execute the unthinkable, the unfathomable, in late December of 2003. First, you will hear from DEA Special Agent Albrecht. He investigated this from a federal angle regarding the illegal drugs that were administered to the unsuspecting victims to render them unconscious and render them helpless over the weekend of December 19th, 20th, and 21st of 2003. You'll also hear from TPD Detective Charles Masucci. He and TPD Detective John Columbia investigated this case. They investigated the two missing men whom you will learn more about, Jason Galehouse and Michael Walkholtz. You'll also hear from Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office Detective Charles Keene. He is specifically involved because the body of Michael Walkholtz was found in the county. Your Honor will have the opportunity to hear live testimony, not readback testimony, but live testimony of Albert Perkins and Jared Paraguay. These are two victims who survived the horror that is Stephen Lorenzo and were brave enough to come forward to law enforcement. You will see photos of the lifeless body of Michael Walkholtz before he was wrapped in bed linens and left to rot in the back of his own Jeep, the Jeep that was strategically and purposely abandoned on the other side of town from where he was last seen. This was done purposely, and we know this because a discussion of this occurred in the chats prior to December of 2003. The court has been previously provided with copies of these chats that I previously mentioned. These chats give a glimpse into the minds of Scott Schweikert and Stephen Lorenzo. The chats lay out their ideas and their plans, and their desire to, as they said, quote, prey on the vulnerability of their victims. Most importantly, Your Honor will hear from Master Scott himself, Scott Schweikert. He'll tell the court how he and Mr. Lorenzo were linked together by Limit Expander, that is the screen name of an individual who linked these two gentlemen together. You will learn how their friendship, if you call it that, progressed. You'll learn that Mr. Lorenzo considered himself to be the experienced bondage master and that Mr. Schweikert was a novice. Both men, through the course of their, we'll call it relationship, from October to December of 2003, ultimately had the same goal. They wanted to find unsuspecting young men who were alone in bars. They befriended them and then invited them back to Stephen Lorenzo's house, which was on Powhatan Avenue within the city of Tampa, for some drinks and a consensual bondage session. However, Mr. Schweikert and Mr. Lorenzo had different plans. Once the young men were to get back to Mr. Lorenzo's house, they were going to, and I quote from the chats, use and abuse them to see how far Mr. Schweikert and Mr. Lorenzo would go, and to see how well they would work together. You'll hear about the night of Friday, December 19th, 2003. Mr. Schweikert was living in Orlando at the time, and he drove over from Orlando to Tampa to Mr. Lorenzo's house on Powhatan Avenue. A plan was in place. They went to 2606. That is a gay bar that's located at 2606 Armenia. It was there that they met Jason Galehouse. Mr. Galehouse accepted an invitation to go back to Mr. Lorenzo's house for some drinks and a bondage session. He even agreed to be tied to the bed. Then, just as had been discussed in those chats, in the months leading up to this night, Mr. Lorenzo, sitting on the bed, with Mr. Galehouse lying on the bed, tied to the bed, at his ankles and at his hands, did a chokehold on Mr. Galehouse from behind. At that point, Mr. Schweikert will tell you that he held down Mr. Galehouse's feet. Mr. Galehouse remained strapped to the bed. Mr. Schweikert will tell you that he fought, but ultimately, that chokehold is what killed him. And just as had been discussed in that text that I previously referenced, Mr. Lorenzo did exactly what he said he was going to do. He did a chokehold from behind. He was held down as Mr. Galehouse was strapped up, and he was never to be found again. The murder of Jason Galehouse is the very definition of cold, calculated, and premeditated. This is evidenced by the chats, as well as the testimony of Mr. Schweikert himself. In these chats, Mr. Schweikert and Mr. Lorenzo even refer to what they are doing as cold and calculated. After Mr. Galehouse was killed, his body was wrapped and put on a trailer in the driveway of Mr. Lorenzo's home. Mr. Schweikert and Mr. Lorenzo went to breakfast. They went to Home Depot to buy supplies. The supplies that they needed included contractor garbage bags, the large, very strong garbage bags. They then went back to Mr. Lorenzo's house. Mr. Schweikert will tell you that they carried Mr. Galehouse's body into the garage, where he was dismembered. Head and torso stayed together. Arm, leg, and leg. The torso and the head were double bagged, as was each other body part, individually in double bagged contractor bags. Mr. Galehouse's clothes were also placed in their own bag, as well as the saw. At that point then, the two men drove around for several hours, distributing Mr. Galehouse's body parts throughout the area. Once was not enough, though. Later that evening, after they had determined that in fact they did work well together, they wanted more. Saturday night, December 20th, 2003, they went back to 2606. It was there that they met Michael Walkholtz. He was alone at the end of the night and stopped by for a drink. They befriended him and invited him back to Mr. Lorenzo's house. Once they got back to Mr. Lorenzo's house, both Mr. Schweikert and Mr. Lorenzo had a role to play. Mr. Schweikert will tell you that it was his job, his role, to distract Mr. Walkholtz, who was sitting on the counter between the kitchen and the living room with his back to the kitchen. Mr. Schweikert will tell you it was his job to talk to him and distract him while Mr. Lorenzo poured a glass of wine for Mr. Walkholtz. He then drugged that wine, put in an illegal drug to render, ultimately, Mr. Walkholtz unconscious and helpless. Things went off the rails rather quickly. Mr. Walkholtz tasted the wine. There was something about it that didn't quite taste right, Mr. Schweikert will tell you. And Mr. Schweikert walked into the living room to find Mr. Lorenzo trying to hold Mr. Walkholtz down. As he was doing this, Mr. Walkholtz was yelling, was screaming, "This is not consensual. This is not consensual." At that point, Mr. Lorenzo grabbed a rag and grabbed a can of something called Maximum Impact. Its legitimate use, I submit to you legitimate use, is to clean keyboards. It is an aerosol can. It is also something, though, that when sprayed upon a rag and held up against someone's nose and mouth can render them unconscious. That is what made Mr. Walkholtz pass out. Mr. Lorenzo holding a rag sprayed with Maximum Impact on the rag. They then stripped Mr. Walkholtz of all of his clothes. They cuffed his hands, they cuffed his ankles, and they duct taped his mouth. Your Honor will see photographs of the unnatural position of Mr. Walkholtz's legs over his own shoulders as he lay on his stomach. His legs were flipped up over his head. As he was losing consciousness from the Maximum Impact and the drugs that had been administered to him in his wine, Mr. Lorenzo then violently, you will hear from Mr. Schweikert, stuffed a rag, not the same rag, a different rag, stuffed a rag into Mr. Walkholtz's anus. This, of course, is a sexual battery. You will hear from Mr. Schweikert that Mr. Walkholtz was in and out of consciousness, but it was likely the force of that rag being shoved into his anus that made him regain consciousness. It was shortly after this that Mr. Walkholtz, as Mr. Schweikert will tell you, died. The medical examiner indicated and opined that Mr. Walkholtz died as a result of homicidal violence. His death at the hands of Mr. Schweikert and Mr. Lorenzo, working in concert with one another, was especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel. And it did in fact occur during the commission of that sexual battery. Mr. Schweikert will tell you about the cleanup, the photographs that were taken by Mr. Lorenzo of Mr. Walkholtz's body in that unnatural position that I mentioned. Many photographs of Mr. Walkholtz's feet. Mr. Walkholtz in a shower tub, appearing to be very much dead. You will hear about the decision to dump Mr. Walkholtz's body in an open but unlikely location. As I mentioned earlier, his body was found in the county. It was found very far away from where he was last seen, and that was something that was discussed in the chats previously. You will learn that Mr. Walkholtz, as I mentioned, was killed on December the 21st. That is the Sunday morning before Christmas in 2003. Christmas was a very important time and was specifically chosen by Mr. Schweikert and Mr. Lorenzo because losing a loved one at Christmas time would cause the families even more pain. Pain is what Pam Williams, the mother of Jason Galehouse, and Ruth Walkholtz, the mother of Michael, have suffered for the last 20 Christmases. These two mothers, one of whom did not have a body to bury, doesn't have a grave to visit, have been delayed justice and denied justice for almost 20 years. And now is their moment to get justice. The state of Florida stands before Your Honor today to humbly ask you to impose the ultimate, the harshest, the most severe punishment allowed by the laws of this state. a sentence that is ultimately carried out by the governor and by the warden of the Florida State Prison. We ask you to sentence Stephen Lorenzo to death. The aggravating factors, it is clear, outweigh any mitigating factors that there may be. A sentence of death for Mr. Lorenzo is the only appropriate sentence. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Ms. Lopez.